Fish are friends, not food.
I'm a little worried about Rob.
Yes, it's happening.
Ever since we tried to summon Cthulhu, he hasn't been the same.
I'm growing gills. Gills. My transformation into a deep one has finally begun.
Rob, we don't see any gills.
It's these kids getting involved in all this stuff causes them to go crazy.
I think I feel the webbing starting to grow between my fingers.
Welcome to Dinner and a Board Game, a new actual play show about friends, good food, and lots of fun at the gaming table. We're your hosts, Megan and Heath. Each night, I'll invite the gaming group over to my house to cook dinner, sample drinks, and play a board game on one of our customized board game boards. Dinner and a Board Game is an actual play show where you'll be able to watch the game from start to finish, with gameplay dashboards and graphics that help track the turns and allow everyone to follow the game's action. We'll play games like Zombicide, Black Plague, Descent, Journeys in the Dark, Small World, Unearth, and Terraforming Mars. We'll even be joined by special guests such as Lou Anders, J.F. Lewis, and cosmic horror artist David LaRocca. The show is free to watch on YouTube. Just come by my channel, Heath Robinson, and be sure to subscribe. Click Watch Now to start the first episode and join us for fun-filled evenings of dinner and a board game. And now it's time for Table Talk, where we'll be talking about the creative and business side of making things in the tabletop and fantasy genre. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone. I'm Heath, and welcome to this first ever episode, kind of experimental pilot episode of what I'm calling Table Talk. We're going to be talking about the creative and business side of creating things in the tabletop and fantasy genre. And our very first guest for this first episode is Lou Anders, and he's extremely important, I think, as a first guest because he has experience in all three important areas that you could really talk about when you're talking about trying to create things in the fantasy genre, and that is through traditional publishing on your own, and then also working on licensed properties through existing IPs. So, welcome, Lou.
Hey, it is great to be here, Heath. Thank you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to join me tonight, and hopefully everything is working and as it should be. Do you want to give everybody a introduction to who you are and what it is that you have done in 2 or 3 minutes? So everybody can know what you think the most important things of what you do is.
Oh, in 2 or 3 minutes. I'm Lou Anders. I was at one point in time an editor in the science fiction and fantasy field, edited a lot of authors for 15 years. I left that to become a children's book author. I have a children's fantasy series, a middle grade series called Thrones and Bones. The books are Frostborn, Nightborn, and Skyborn. They're for ages 8 to 12, but I wrote them to be for all ages, like The Hobbit. Then there is, thank you.
I actually have the books here. Yeah.
And then there's another novel set in the same world, but a different part of it called Once Upon a Unicorn, which is pitched a little younger, but still in the same milieu. And I wrote Star Wars Pirate's Price, the Star Wars novel that explains why the Millennium Falcon is parked outside Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland. And that was a lot of fun to write. And then I took the occasion of this wonderful global pandemic to do something that I have always wanted to do, which is I created a role-playing game, 5th edition powered RPG campaign setting, set in the land of the first novel, Frostborn, which is a Norse-inspired land called Northengard. And so we did a campaign book and an adventure book, path book that followed it called Sagas of Northengard. And you don't have that one? I can hold that one up.
I don't have that one. I don't have that one. I did.
That was the companion book, Sagas of Northengard.
Oh yeah, I don't have that one, and I didn't have the Once Upon a Unicorn, but I had the others.
And so that's what I did. We took that to Kickstarter last year, and I'm working on several different projects set in that world now.
Okay, all right. So that's why I thought that Lou would be a great guest, is because he's done this through a variety of different channels. And so actually one of the very first things that I'd like to ask is, if you're going the traditionally published route, one of the things that everybody's always afraid of, it seems, that, okay, you're going to write this novel or something, you've got all the plans for all this other stuff that it can do, but you're going to write the novel, then you're going to give it to a publisher, and this can get away from you. And all of a sudden you're not going to have the rights anymore, and they're going to start doing stuff with it that you never intended, and you're not going to be in on it anymore. First of all, is that true?
No.
No. So what actually happens? Like, if you're saying, if you want to build a fantasy world and you want traditional publishing to be a part of it, what should you not be afraid about? How do you preserve your rights, and how do you go about doing
you
that?
always have your rights. You don't need to fear about someone stealing your work or stealing your novel. You are, when publishers buy a novel, they buy the right to publish that novel. They're not buying, the copyright stays with you, the IP stays with you, but they're taking, they're paying you in advance of money against what they expect to earn. And what they bring to the table is, I had, when I was working with Penguin Random House on my novels, I kept getting emails from people that I hadn't met before that were in charge of some aspect of book production. And there were probably 50 people that input in some way or another into my book, into the layout and the design and the copy editing and the editing and the look and feel of it, the art direction. And it was a huge team that helped it all come together. And, when you self-publish, you don't have any of that behind you. You have to do it all yourself, which is its own thing.
Right. And when you say you do it all yourself, like I've done, it means everything.
It means everything.
Every single little thing. Right.
Layout, marketing, editing, branding, outreach, everything. And some people can do that and they're good at it, and some people are not.
And some people can't.
Yeah.
So when you sent your book off, the final manuscript for the Thrones and Bones series, then if you wanted other things to happen to it, because if they're going to publish this book,
right?
But let's say that you do want to talk about having a movie or a TV show or something, other things, then what do you do?
In general, publishers do not take television rights, and I would be skeptical of any publisher that asks to take television rights. So that resides with the author. They may take foreign language rights, or they may take English language rights in other territories like the UK and British Columbia and things like that. But they generally stay out of television rights. And so, what I would do is hire an agent that dealt specifically in TV and film rights.
So in many ways, then, you're still kind of working independently for your own world and your own IP.
Right. Correct.
You're just outsourcing a certain part of it, which is the actual assembly and manufacture of this book and distribution of it.
You're letting experts who know how to produce books. And the publishing gods help those who help themselves. So these days it's very important that an author have a platform already. They're more interested in you if you already have a built-in audience, etc., which is also what you need if you're going to self-publish.
Yes. And then that brings up, like, what should you be doing as an author? Should it be writing books, or should it be trying to get really good at social media? Does it have to be both? Right?
It has to be both. I'm laughing. I years ago I used to know China Mieville, who's a fabulous writer, and was very, very absent from social media. And years ago at San Diego Comic-Con, I remember he told me he thought he was the last person over the transom who could get a publishing deal without a social media account. And then, he closed that door behind them. And now you have to have all that. They got me onto Instagram when I started, because we were doing children's books, and they said, "Oh, well, kids are on Instagram, so you have to be on Instagram." And that was the only reason I was on that service. That's the only place that my demographic ever reached out to me to, for that matter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I did have some kids read my book and check me out on Instagram and communicate with me there.
Okay. Well, that is interesting, because I hear about that so much, like also from actors, like, they're talking about even cast or something. Do you have to have the social media platform? It just seems like that seems to be going with all aspects of creativity today. Well, okay, then let's go on to, let's say that you build the social media platform. Let's say you've got some type of social media reach and you've got this world and you've got a manuscript in it. How do you decide whether you try to do a traditional route or if you go on to try to independently publish?
Ooh, this is an interesting question. I used to, my opinion about independent publishing has completely changed. Obviously, because I've done it. I used to be very down on it for the reason. I mean, the the thing I used to say was that if you're trying to become an expert cat burglar, and every door you come to is wide open, you will never learn how to pick locks. And you need that opposition, you need that resistance, you need those people telling you no, you're not good enough, or no, you're not what we want, in order to fine tune your skills. And when my first, because Frostborn was the third manuscript that I wrote, that the first two manuscripts were rejected, and the first one we sent out just was rejected without a word. Just everyone said no without saying anything. The second manuscript I went out with was a science fiction manuscript, and it was space-based science fiction, and there is not a lot of that in middle grade, and it never ever seems to catch. And we got rejections that were, "This is amazing. This reminds me of the stuff I used to read in the '90s." And this is like the '90s era television. We love it, but we could never publish this. Or, "I love this, but there's no way my marketing department would let me publish this." And or, "Could you turn this into an adult novel, because we can't publish it as a children's novel?" And my agent at the time asked me if I was depressed, and I said no, because these rejections are better than the cricket chirping we had on the first one. And I'm going through the process of learning how to write what the market wants, and I'm getting closer and closer. And then I wrote the third book, and it sold, and it was Penguin Random House made a preemptive bid for it before anybody else had a chance to read it. And so I feel like if you just write your first manuscript and dump it online, you haven't, everything is a muscle. You haven't learned to lift the weights. You haven't honed your skills. You haven't perfected your art, and you need that pushback and that resistance to get better and better and better. And I'm very glad that I went that route. Now the landscape is very different than it was. Prior to the pandemic, we had the lawsuit where the Justice Department sued Barnes and Noble and the big then 6 publishers, and they consolidated into the big 4 publishers. And then we had the landscape shifted pretty big when Borders Books went under, and now the new he's not new, he's been there a few years, but the new CEO of Barnes and Noble is keeping books on the shelf a lot for not nearly as long as he used to. There's a much higher turnover. They're being more picky about what books are stocked. More of the floor space is being devoted to things that aren't books. And publishing has responded by clamping down on that mid list and going for more celebrity authors. So it's harder to land a publishing deal now than it used to be, and it's harder to get eyeballs on your book when you do. So
but you're also going to need an agent in order to go the traditional route. And so if you, what if you want to attempt that? Say you've got the social media following and you're like, okay, now I need an agent. Now what? Send out a whole bunch of queries from the writer's market?
Yes. And if you're writing a genre book, you've got it easier, because you can go to places like the World Fantasy Convention and the World Science Fiction Convention, and you can meet agents there and socialize with them, and you can meet editors there, and you can meet other writers there who can give you advice. I have no idea what to do if you're just writing a general fiction book, but if you are writing a romance or a mystery or a science fiction fantasy novel, you do have built-in venues that will support you, that you can go and become a part of, that will make the journey, if not a lot easier, at least more attainable.
We had a question come in from Blake, and let's see if there we go. He asks, would you revise those earlier stories now that you've leveled up?
I thought about that. I did. Thank you, Blake. I thought about going back to them, and they're not worth it. I would not. I feel guilty for. I think that this is going to take us down the road of metaphysics, but I think that ideas exist independently of us, that they have a life independently of our head. I was years and years and years ago. I was working for a site called bookface.com, and we were an early online reading site back in 2000, before during the .com bubble. And they sent me to the Romance Writers of America convention, and I was sitting in a panel at the Romance Writers of America convention because we were there to talk up romance writers about the technology we were building. And I started getting this idea for a romance story, and I felt so guilty because I knew I was never going to write it. And I felt like this like, bright little romance story idea came to the conference looking for a romance writer, and up in the clouds saw my head and leapt into it, and then went, oh my God, no, this is a science fiction writer, abort, abort, abort. But by that point it was too late, and it died in my head. And I feel so guilty about that. And so I feel guilty for my first protagonist that I've never gone back and finished her story. But and this is, the first novel was a contemporary paranormal adventure, and the second novel, as I said, was science fiction. And for the third novel, I was like, I'm going to write what I always wanted to write, which was fantasy, which was somewhere between sword and sorcery and epic fantasy. And when I did that, I created the world first, and I made it big enough to be the setting that I could do anything in for the rest of my life. And I would like to just fill out that world now.
So all of your stories and novels then have been traditionally published.
Yes.
Okay, but then when you decided to go and do an RPG, because you wanted an RPG set in your world, you decided to go independent publishing. So what made you decide to do that? And did you ever decide, or did you ever think about looking for a publisher for it?
Yeah, I did not. Years ago, I queried one publisher about publishing an RPG in my world, and I got radio silence back, rightly so. And when I wanted to do this one, I wanted to control it all, and I wanted to learn it all. I managed to be an art director for 10 years without ever opening Photoshop, and I felt like it was time for me to pay my dues. So I did all the layout on this book too. I taught myself how to do layout and design, and it was a massive, massive undertaking, but it was something that I felt like I've always needed to know how to do. And I just wanted to be able to control every aspect of it, and have it be exactly like I wanted it to be.
Well, we do talk about rules and things on this channel. We've been having some great discussion actually through video with people talking about randomness in RPGs and different rule systems and things like that. So how did you decide what rule set that you were going to use for Thrones and Bones?
I played with, and I love it. I love the Fate RPG system. And I had actually run a game in my world for 2 years using the Fate system. And the second novel, as I was writing it, I was also gaming around that same area of the world. And stuff in the novel that I was writing was going into the game, and stuff in the game was going in the novel. And I will put in a plug for Fate as an amazing system for writers to play.
I want to talk more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, we can totally go that. But but then in my own life, my Fate game flipped, and we started playing 5e, and you've played 5e with me.
Yes.
And
yes.
it was, it became apparent that was just the game that everybody's playing. That if you want the reach, you need to have 5th edition. You need to be, your game needs to support 5th edition. I would love to go back and do a Fate edition of my world at some point, but I don't know if it has the audience base to support the effort required. That would have to be just a project, a labor of love. But I love the 5th edition rule set. I think it's fantastic, and I have a ball designing for it. And I had done some design for 3D printed tabletop, and then I started doing design for Cobalt Press. And I think I've finally gotten. I don't want to jinx myself or sound like I'm not humble, but I think I've finally got a grasp on how to design for 5th edition, and I'm really kind of proud of the elegance of some of my mechanics.
Okay.
I hope they don't change it too much, because I'll have to relearn.
Yeah, I know. I wonder what's coming with any type of revision. I wonder about that. I haven't thought too much about it myself, but I do wonder. Uh, in fact, we should go back and cover one other thing before we go forward talking about fate and rule set. But first of all, we do have another comment here that asks why fantasy, and I think that's it. I think he was talking about when you're deciding what to write and the kinds of things that you do. So, but I think it's a good question, like what draws you to fantasy genre over other things. You did say that you wrote some sci-fi.
Right.
So, I mean, some of it's probably a business decision, but in general, why the appeal of the fantasy?
The first two novels, I was trying to write what I thought I could sell. And with the third novel, I wrote what I wanted to write. And my earliest influences were I read all the Edgar Rice Burroughs books when I was young. I read massive amounts of Fritz Lieber and Michael Moorcock, and I read Robert E. Howard, but Lieber and Moorcock were really my biggest loves. And um, I wanted to capture the way that I felt when I was 12 years old reading about Elric or Conan or Fafhrd the Grey Mouser. And at the same time, I wanted to write a book for my kids and for today's kids. And I wanted to write a book that reflected the more of a modern sensibility. And I mean, it's kind of funny. There's a Robert E. Howard has a story called The Frost Giant's Daughter, which is supposed to be sort of his attempt to do something like Leda and Zeus, that's the story everybody knows, where Conan's on the battlefield and he sees the beautiful woman and she tempts him and he runs after her and he chases her through the snows and he gets ambushed by her brothers and their frost giants and he kills them both. And then she appeals to Ymir, the god of the frost giants, and he takes her away. And Conan is left clutching her clothes, wondering if she was real or not. And nowadays, it bugs me that she's just there as a sexual foil. As a kid, it drove me nuts that her brothers are frost giants, but she's normal sized. And I was like, why is she normal sized and her brothers are giants? Why isn't she a giant? And also I tried to reread Conan and I just can't do it. And so I wanted to come up with a character who would be I was like, well, she's half size because she's half giant. And I want to write a female Conan. And that's when I came up with Fianna Frostborn, who's half human, half frost giant. She's in the book, she's 12 years old and 7 feet tall. And that was the genesis of that character. And then everything just tumbled out from there.
Well, while we're talking about that, though, what about the gamer inspiration for the protagonist of the Thrones and Bones, Frostborn? The influence of gaming on what's the guy's name? I'm sorry.
Which guy? Karn Corlunders.
Yes.
Yeah, so I had created Theana, and she was at that point too in the narrative, I did what you should never do, because you should start from character. But I was an editor, as I mentioned, for 15 years, and all of my friends were successful writers or TV producers or comic book writers or famous artists. And I was really, really kind of afraid to put my stuff out there alongside of them. And I thought, going back to that idea that ideas are not, that we don't originate ideas, that they exist somewhere outside of us. I thought, if I just make this world so authentic that you can't argue with it, then my ability to write it won't matter, because I'm not writing it, I'm transcribing it, I'm bringing it through. And so I wrote like 40,000 words of world building. And I started with the Norse inspired culture, thinking I could start at the edge of the world, and then I would not have to worry about the rest of the world until I found out whether or not I could even write. But as I started working out their history, I started paralleling what the actual Scandinavians were doing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they went to France, they went to England, they went to Constantinople, they went to Canada, they probably went to the moon for all I know. And every time they butted up against a culture, I then created my world's analog of that culture. So before I ever plotted anything, I had 50,000 words of multiple countries with languages and religious pantheons and histories going back 5,000 years. And I had this whole world taking shape. And this is also around the time that I was starting to get back into role-playing by buying campaign settings and immersing myself in all the wonderful world guides. And then my wife was like, well, you have to have a male protagonist too. You can't just have a female protagonist. You've got to have a boy protagonist. And because I hadn't planned on creating Karn at the time, and then I thought, well, Theana, it's a good character tip that every character needs a problem, but they also need something that they're really, really good at. If you think of something like How to Train Your Dragon, Hiccup's problem is that he's not a big muscular Viking. He lives in a society of Vikings that only respect your ability to swing an axe, and he cannot. But he's also exceptionally good at making things. He's really good at that. No one around him values that, but he's really, really, he's a brilliant inventor. And characters need to have something that they excel at. And Theana excelled at sports. She was a huge, very physical character. And so he couldn't excel at sports. So I thought, well, if it's not sports, what's it going to be? And in real life, the Vikings played a board game called Hnefatafl that they played quite enthusiastically until it was eventually replaced by chess. And so I thought, he's a board gamer. And then I went from there and was like, well, the gamer personality is going to have been the same. The way that we're about our Xboxes and our Nintendos today, they would have been with boards. And so I wrote him as a modern day gamer. I mean, not with colloquial English, but I wrote him with the same attitude as a gamer. And it was a little bit around that time that that article popped up about that Egyptian D20.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I'm like, yep. See, there's always been gamers. There's nothing changes, and so that's how he became the board gamer. And then, as I wrote that novel, I originally I was just going to use Hnefatafl, but we don't have an agreed upon rule set for that. We have rules reconstructions, and they're quite different. There's many different versions of the game, and they differ on things as basic as how many squares there are on the board and whether or not you use dice and whether the king exits just through the corners or from any side. And so eventually I was like, I need to know what the rules are. And since there are no one set of rules, I might as well make my own. So I took rules from different versions and I combined them and I made up some of my own rules. And I spent about a week playtesting. And then my two nephews at the time were chess champions in the state of Alabama, both of them. And I took them to Starbucks and let them play each other, and they played each other over and over again for about 3 hours and loved it. So I knew I had something. We ended up publishing the rules in the back of the game, and again in the back of the book. Yeah, in the back of the book, and then we published them again in the role-playing game.
So that's everything coming kind of in a circle. Not only are there games about the Thrones and Bones world, but the Thrones and Bones world was generated from a game.
Well, it's really in a circle because I started with Edgar Rice Burroughs, and book 5, The Chessmen of Mars, John Carter fights on a live chessboard. And spoiler, you have to do that in the first adventure in the in the Thrones and Bones campaign setting in the sample starter adventure.
Let's take this comment from Eric right here. Let's see if I can get it up there. He says, that's a lot of world and games to build and remember and weave together. What sort of tools do you use for world building? How do you keep track of this? Do you ever use such thing as spreadsheets?
I am going to laugh. I don't use spreadsheets. I use Scrivener, which is a wonderful tool. And I use Scrivener for everything. Not just for writing the manuscript, but you can put anything into Scrivener. You can put, art and photographs for reference. I keep all of my editor's notes in Scrivener. I keep all the reviews it gets in Scrivener. So it's just one program that becomes the total repository of everything: research, notes, inspiration, the manuscript itself, different edition, revisions of the manuscript, and then feedback and reviews all in one place. And when I wrote the first novel, when I was doing the dragon, I wanted a unique. I didn't want to do Smaug. I grew up on I think it's Richard Boone's Smaug in the animated Hobbit, and he was the quintessential dragon voice for me for all time. And no offense to Benedict Cumberbatch, but I wanted to do a dragon, but I didn't want to have Richard Boone's voice in my head. So I went on Facebook and I said, who's not voiced the dragon that should have? And I got about 100 responses, including Sean Connery from somebody who does not know Connery's filmography.
I was about to say Sean Connery has, yeah.
And someone said David Bowie, which was wonderful. So I went looking and I found all these early interviews with young Bowie from the 60s and 70s, where the British press at the time are a bunch of like stodgy, old, snooty people who have no respect or liking for the young rock stars. And they're so snide in that wonderfully British way. And Bowie is sitting there smoking cigarettes and responding to these really rude questions. And you can tell he's getting angry, but he never, ever, ever is anything less than polite. But as he gets angrier and angrier, you can just see the bar going up, and he's smoldering, and smoke is coming out his nostrils. And I was like, oh my God, that's my dragon right there. So every time I had to write the dragon, I would watch a clip of David Bowie get needled by the British press, and then I would write in that voice.
That's great. I love that. I love that. Okay, well, let's go back to Fate then. Let's jump back down to where we were. Oh wait, did we? No, wait, hold on. There was one other thing I was supposed to talk about before we get back to the gaming part of this, because there's the third stool of the fantasy building, fantasy design here that you've been a part of, and that is writing for existing IPs and the mother of existing IPs. So we'll get to Fate after this, but you have written a Star Wars novel. You contracted with the Star Wars novel. So this one right here, as we were just saying, Star Wars: A Pirate's Price. So that is, I guess, kind of a third way that instead of trying to create your own stuff and then either go traditionally published with it or try to independently publish stuff, the other way to do it would be to try to work on existing worlds, which I guess has advantages and disadvantages if you can do it. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of that? And of course, you've done a lot more of your own stuff than contract work. What is that experience like?
That's hard work to go after. They came to me for that. That's not, and it, but one of the advantages is there's a huge fan base for that. And most of them are there for whatever the property is and aren't going to follow you home, but some of them do follow you home. And I've made a lot of friends, made a lot of contacts, and gotten some readers from the Star Wars. One of the advantages is Star Wars, and it was absolutely a blast to do. And the character I wrote about was Hondo Ohnaka, who's an animated character from the Clone Wars and from Star Wars Rebels, and he's voiced by Jim Cummings. And he's got a very singular voice. And when I was approached to write the novel, I said, "Can I write it in first person? Because it has to be in his voice. It has to be told in his voice." And my editor said, "I don't think we've ever done a first person book before, but sure." And we wrote it in first person, and then I was having lunch with her, and I said, "I don't know if you guys do audiobooks." And she goes, "Yeah, we do audiobooks." I said, "Well, has anybody approached Jim Cummings to do the audiobook?" And she's like, "I don't know, I'll check." And she called up the audiobook department, and they had already signed someone and hadn't even thought to ask Cummings. And she prodded them to ask Cummings, and he said yes. So he reads the audiobook in Hondo's voice, and it's awesome. It's also probably like Hondo is a reoccurring character, but I doubt that all of his lines together from Clone Wars and Rebels adds up to more than like a chapter. And so this is probably the most Hondo Ohnaka he's ever done in his life. And it's absolutely beautiful. There's one section where Hondo is imitating Han Solo. And so you get to hear Hondo's impression of Solo, and it's hysterical.
But that was something that people came to you for.
Yes.
You didn't go out and seek that out.
Yes.
Because like for instance, people are working on the One Ring role-playing game and things like that, and that must be fun. I suppose there must be some ways where you could go out and try to. I suppose you could go out and get a license, but I guess that's a different kind of way that you go out and try to get a license for something. Right. But most of the time,
if you're in the role-playing game industry and you have a company, you can go after the license and produce a game. If you're a writer, your best bet again is to go to the conventions and meet the editors and try and express interest that way.
Okay, well then let's go back to Fate then, because you had this phrase that I've used, actually another one that I said that it came from you, which was that you're not trying to simulate reality in a role-playing game. You are trying to simulate storytelling. And Fate, so what does that mean to you, and how do you do that?
So Fate in particular is really, really good at this. The mechanic in Fate it's not so much about lopping off hit points until the other person dies. It's about creating what they call aspects, but are basically advantages and opportunities on the other character. So you might provoke the other character to make them needled or unsettled, and then that becomes an aspect that's on their character. Or you might look for an advantage in their, a chink in their armor that they haven't noticed, and you're actually creating that at the table. Going, I've just noticed that the greave on their arm is loose, and then when you get enough of those things, you cash them in for bonuses, so you can KO them in a blow. And it's the example I like to use is like, and I love both systems. This isn't they're both good at what they're good at, but you could never do Smaug and Bilbo in Dungeons and Dragons. Bilbo is at best a third level thief. And in Dungeons and Dragons, Bilbo walks in, the ancient dragon blows a fireball at him, there's no more Bilbo. But in Fate, Bilbo sneaks in and he intrigues Smaug. He's infuriating Smaug, he's puzzling Smaug, and then he creates the hole in Smaug's diamond armor, the patch of bare skin over his left breast. That's an aspect at Fate that would have been created with a dice roll at the time, where Bilbo is rolling to affect the other person. And then he's stacked up all these things, which he passes off to Bard the Bowman, who produces his magical black arrow from nowhere and cashes that in, and then he shoots and kills Smaug with one blow. And that's how the Fate mechanic works. And you could never get those because Fate isn't really about leveling up so much as it is about capturing. Batman doesn't level up. Batman is the same. You don't have a level 1 Batman and a level 10 Batman. Batman is Batman. So like a superhero context, I think, would work better in Fate than it would work in Dungeons and Dragons, where the character is who they are, and there may be small progressions or tools that are invented to meet the situation, but it's really about that moment where James Bond is fighting Oddjob and he punches him, and Oddjob just smiles. So then he turns around and finds a gold brick and he hits him with the gold brick. That gold brick has been manifested for Bond to find at the right opportune moment. And when you watch cinematic combat, it's almost never just two people punching each other till one goes down. It's always about things in the environment that shift, that give one person or the other the advantage until they find that way around the other person's defenses. And Fate models that really, really, really well. Fate also, you could take the same mechanic and you could have no combat at all, and you could just have a dinner party where people are making snide comments at each other and scoring social points and building up or tearing down each other using the rule system. And it would work and be just as exciting as if you were fighting a combat. So I think it's a marvelous system for writers to try.
Well, okay, then let's talk about the relationship between role-playing and storytelling then.
Well, that's what got me back into role-playing, is I was editing a book line, and I noticed that a lot of my fantasy writers played Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder or wrote for Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. And I felt like the ones that did were creating deeper and more interesting fantasy worlds than the ones that didn't. And no offense to the ones that didn't. I don't. And so I started buying campaign books again. And I wasn't playing. I was just buying the campaign books and looking into them. And then I got very interested in the way that, the genre was sword and sorcery with Conan and the other people I've mentioned. And then sword and sorcery went away after the 70s and epic fantasy replaced it. And it was kept alive in role-playing games and in the novels by R.A. Salvatore. And then we're about 10 to 15 years ago, sword and sorcery came back and began to color epic fantasy with George Martin and Joe Abercrombie and the whole grimdark movement. And now you have it back, but I think it was preserved in gaming, and that's what kept it alive before it came back to the genre it started in.
So when we're talking about like stacking the different aspects and things like that, when we're talking about fate and that kind of story structure, we've been talking about on the channel, randomness and things like that. And I was trying to, maybe I haven't expressed this well, but it wasn't that Bilbo has some some random chance of perhaps defeating, or even in this case, even Bard the Bowman, that it's deliberate decisions that those characters have made
Right.
that have caused that to manifest.
They're creating aspects that they're overlaying on Smaug. And when they've stacked up 6 or 7 of them, they cash each aspect in for a +2 on their dice roll. And but it's about looking for or creating advantages on the target.
And it's not about just going for the
It's
random shot.
It's not whittling down the hit points.
It's not
Right.
whittling down hit points. It's not going for a random lucky shot. Well,
Right.
can I have a 1 in 1,000 chance of hitting a weak point on Smog? That wasn't what happened either. It was something deliberate and narrative,
Yep.
and the choices they made. Because if they hadn't made those choices, they would have failed.
Correct.
And if those
they
things
just
hadn't
tried to chop off the hit points, they would have died pretty quickly.
Okay, let's talk about another interesting subject right here, because this is something that I've been writing on. And actually, I talk about Lou's take on this in one of the videos, but it's not done editing yet. They're taking me a long time to edit. My first video, I've got a series of 3 videos on orcs and the personhood of orcs and how they manifest in fantasy over the years. The first video is out. So the first video you can find on the channel. The second video is going to be a timeline. Second and third, I believe, are both timelines, but they're taking a long time to edit. And I talk about Lou's placement of that in here. But I think that his take on this is very interesting. So do you want to talk about your philosophy of orcs and how that has manifested in your worlds?
It's always bothered me since I was a kid that the orcs are just wiped out. They run into the forest and they don't come out, and there are no more orcs. And it was always bothered me that it was okay to commit genocide against them because they're just unilaterally bad. And years ago, before I even knew I was going to write a novel, I said, if I ever write a novel, my orcs are not going to be mindless, evil savages that you can just butcher indiscriminately. They're going to be the most sophisticated people on the planet. And I came back to that in my second novel, where they're not called orcs, they're called Oskiri, but they're gray-skinned, white-haired orcs. And the Oskiri, they are expansionistic empire. They do want to conquer, but they want to do so because they feel that they have a compulsion to elevate the rest of the world to their level. So they come in, conquer a place, kill the leaders, then they build libraries and schools, and everybody becomes part of the Oskirian empire. And I have a character named Dargan Urgal, who is an ambassador from the Skiri Empire, who's traveling the world because he thinks all the barbarians are charming, but he wants to see them before they get inevitably absorbed into his own empire for the greater good. And I like that about them. So there's no savage brute orc. There's just a highly expansionistic, highly superior culture.
I think that the humanization of the orc has been something that has gone on over the decades.
It probably goes back to that original World of Warcraft game.
I think it does.
Yeah, where you can play as the human or you can play as the orc.
As far as I've been able to find, that was the first. And other people in the chat and who are watching, please let me know if you have another reference. But that's the earliest reference, the original Warcraft Orcs versus Human, that started to introduce this idea of kind of orc as a person in a broad sense. Maybe there's an earlier reference. I would love to find it. But whenever I ask, people also bring up that one.
Well, you've seen that cartoon where the people who worship the rabbit god and the people who worship the duck god, and they're trying to wipe each other out.
No, I haven't seen
Oh, it's hysterical. It's just a bunch of knights on 2 hillsides, and they're both charging into the valley, and they're both like, we worship the one true rabbit god, but they worship the duck god. And it's a silhouette that looks like this. And so depending on how you do it, it's a duck or a rabbit. And that's what World of Warcraft was for me, the original one, because you play as the human, then you play as the orc. And the resource building is exactly the same. And so it's impossible to play both sides for any length of time without realizing that who's good and who's bad is a matter of where you're standing.
Does your
very subversive for an early video game?
And it has had a whole lot of impact because I think also as you have people who are playing orcs, they become less demonic. I think probably because game companies also, if you're going to be playing this, probably also, it's a cycle. Then we should probably tone down a demonic aspect of this. Especially with the satanic panic and things like that, orcs can just be like people, right? How do you think that that your own views on the demonic or existence of evil influence that opinion that you had on orcs?
I don't know. I have not explored what the hells are in my world yet. Um, there's a fascinating book called The Big Book of Hell, by the way. It came out a long time ago, 25 years ago, which is an examination of all the different cultures of the world views on afterlives that punish you. And I don't know what place it holds in, because in Norengard, there's no place of punishment. When you die, you either, if you're not selected for one of the warriors' halls, then you go to Neth's cave, which is just kind of a place where everybody else goes. But it might be boring, but it's not a place of punishment. And the people who are evil linger on as Draugr, as the undead in their burrows. So the ones who are too consumed by anger or greed or lust or regret to properly die linger near the surface in their graves as undead. And so that is the hell. It's a hellish existence of being, of being unable to fully die, and having this undead existence. I feel like there's Star Trek, Star Wars, and Doctor Who. Star Trek, evil is a verb, not a noun. Evil is ignorance. It's a lack of understanding. It's failure to appreciate that we're all one, that everyone should, and that enlightened altruism is the better philosophy. And so the progress in Star Trek is for races like the Klingons, who are evil races to begin with, to become rehabilitated as they evolve and mature. And Doctor Who, evil is a real thing. It's the monster from outer space who's made a deal with the greedy corporate guy to sell out the Earth. And it's a noun. And in Star Wars, I don't. It's just a back and forth. It's continual. And I think I prefer the Star Trek perspective on evil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. Because in this series on orcs that I'm working on, once I get past the timeline, I've been trying to come up with my own, some kind of analysis and synthesis of it. And I think it does have to do with your take on it, with whether or not someone does believe in an objective evil or whether they don't. Yeah. And then, and where our society is and how that changes, has changed orcishness to our society. Because, if assuming you do believe in a good and evil, like if you're good and evil, you wouldn't want to demonize the human. Things that are human should not be demonized because you're supposed to recognize their humanity. But then perhaps we should also recognize the reverse of that, which is, well, you don't want to humanize the demonic. If you believe in evil, you don't want to humanize it. That would also be something that was bad. If you believed in that as, a metaphysical thing. And I think there's something in there, but I'm still working on thinking all the way through that and what that is. Because actually, do you know that there are people who call the Russian soldiers in Ukraine orcs?
No, that's hysterical.
If you go to Reddit, because that is part of the thing. I was like, well, this is sort of my theme of, demonizing the human, because I found some pictures of this from Reddit for people who have actually drawn the Russian soldiers as orcs. And then also it's not uncommon to just refer to Russian soldiers as killing orcs. And I think there's probably an academic article in it, if I were to go back to academic writing. So I think there's probably a lot more to the philosophy of orcishness that we should continue to talk about in society today. Well, let me ask you about this, because I know you do have some opinions on this. I mean, this kind of goes back to the publishing and business side of things. And by the way, probably what I will do is I will probably try to take some clips from this show. And but also I'll put some of them that are most have to do with sort of the fantasy parts of see if I can screen share this.
Oh, I wonder. Shift it.
Yep.
I was going to say, if you humanize evil too much, you end up with a $1 billion movie starring Joaquin Phoenix.
Yes, could be. Let's see. Oh, this is not. Let me. This is technology problem here. Oh, I can't. Okay, that's not letting me capture the screen again. I'll fix that up. But what I was going to say is that I'll probably use some clips here on this, and I'll put some of the clips that have most to do with the fantasy and world building and stuff like that here on this channel. But I do have a secondary channel for those of you who don't know. It's called Heath's Business for Creatives. You can find it on YouTube, and on that channel, I do put all the stuff that has to do with the business side of being a creative and working stuff like that. So if we have some of the things that aren't so fantasy focused, I might end up putting them over there. So please check out both channels. And if you are a person who is interested in creating your own fantasy worlds and trying to do it yourself in an independent way, please do check out the Heath's Business for Creatives. It's got about 150 videos over there already on that subject. And so some of these questions may appear over there. But okay, so the other question is then, what impact do you think that the Kickstarter that Brian Sanderson just ran is going to have on publishing and fantasy?
I don't think
And for those of you who don't know, it's now the largest Kickstarter ever for the 3 Brandon Sanderson novels that he brought out.
Yeah, did he end up with $32 million or something? Insane.
It was something like that. I didn't look to see what his final number was. I probably did.
Maybe
But I don't remember.
that's surely it wasn't. Let me see. It was an insane amount. 4 Secret Novels by Brandon Sanderson, and it ended up with where's the $41 million.
$41 million.
Yep. I'm sorry, my dogs are trying to get in here. I don't think it's going to have that big an impact because Sanderson has spent over a decade building up a company that monetizes his fantasy worlds to his fans. You know, they've already been selling toys and trinkets and things and autographed books and things like that for years. So he has something like 50 employees in a system with warehousing and fulfillment issues already tackled. And so he has the and he's the fastest writer on earth. You know,
he must be.
And the most prolific. And so he has a fan base that knows that knocking off 4 extra books is a no risk proposition for them. Because it's not like he's going to get in there to it and say, you know what, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. Or my publisher's offered me money for these books. If his publisher is jealous, he can just write 4 other novels in the next 2 weeks and give them to the publisher. And then he has this fulfillment system in place. And somebody else would have to learn all of these things from scratch. So we may have authors doing one-offs, you know, but one, I think you have to be near the level of a Brandon Sanderson to get that kind of response to begin with. And 2, you've got to be prolific enough. So even if you know Stephen King does a Kickstarter for 1 book or George Martin does a Kickstarter for 1 book, I don't think it's going to turn publishing on its ear. You know, I mean, Sanderson is one of those authors who publishing in general does better the year he has a book out than when he doesn't. You know, when Harry Potter was coming out, I mean, the whole publishing industry. The health of the publishing industry went up and down based on whether or not she had a book out. And but in Sanderson's case, it's not taking a slice of the pie away from anyone else because he'll just write another slice.
For you, let's say for where you're planning on going from here, and I guess also your kind of faith in the industry, because you're kind of interested in having books or movies or TV shows about in your worlds, right? How would you go about trying to make that happen? And do you, with a lot of things that are bad that come out now, like how much faith do you have that someone would actually do a good job if you gave it to them? And so how would you even maintain that kind of control?
Well,
or any, I don't know.
You know, one, I don't know how much. I mean, like Rick Riordan says he's never watched any of the original Percy Jackson movies because they didn't want his involvement. He knew they were going to be bad, and he didn't want bad versions of the characters coloring his own interpretation of them. But he also says that without those movies, he wouldn't have been the success that he is. So even a bad adaptation moves the needle tremendously. A bad adaptation is probably better for the author than no adaptation. But I'm fortunate right now. I'm actually working with a production company called Tiny Giants, who are interested in several of my properties. And in fact, there's one that we're developing that's based on an unpublished manuscript. And I'm phenomenally busy right now. And I'm afraid that if we get film interest in that, I'm going to have to finish that manuscript, and I don't have time right now. But they're interested in Thrones and Bones, and they're interested in this unpublished manuscript, and they're interested in some other ideas. So hopefully something will happen with that, although it's way early days.
How did you get involved with that? Did they find, is it no situation where they found you, or did you go to look for
That
it?
was a mutual writer I worked with who worked with them, recommended me to them. And they're run by a guy named Stu Gamble, and we hit it off, and we've become friends, and have been looking to collaborate for a while.
So are you positive about the state of sci-fi and fantasy, or are you not so much?
The state in which way? I mean, I think we're in a golden age of television. It's never been better. There's so many fantastic offerings on television right now. I can't stand it. I can't keep up. Um, in terms of brick and mortar book publishing, like I said, things have contracted. I've gone from someone who said never self-published to I think if I had a novel right now, I'm 100% in gaming right now, and I'm also I'm working for someone else right now developing a fantasy world, and it's taking 99.9% of my time. But if I did have a novel, I would take a long, hard look at whether I wanted to traditionally publish it or independently publish it. And I might independently publish it.
That is, it's very interesting because I remember when I first talked to you years ago that you were still in the anti
Yep.
self-publishing mode of thoughts. It's very interesting that you've come both ways on that.
Well,
Here's
part
an
of it is
interesting.
I have learned how to pick the lock, so I feel like I have
Well,
in the dues.
right, you
And
figured out
now,
how to do it, right?
yeah, and the other part is that publishing has contracted so much that unless I was confident that the publisher really could offer me, I mean, if they're just going to get me like 2 weeks in Barnes and Noble and then ditch the book, I'd rather just do it myself and have full control and write it exactly like I wanted it and produce it my way. But it just depends. I mean,
Here's a
one of the
question.
things that I'm doing right now is I'm working on I'm doing an anthology of adult fantasy stories set in the world of Norgard, and it's going to be working title is Tales from Stolke's Tavern, which is a mead hall in Binsa, the port city in Norgard. And I'm working with a lot of the writers I used to work with when I was an editor and editing them again for the first time in 8 to 10 years. And we've gotten about 60,000 words of story in right now, waiting on about seven more stories to come in. And then I'll
But
take
that's
that.
in your world.
That's in my world.
Yeah, right.
Other
So
writers in my world.
how is that? What is that like having other people write then in your world? Obviously, you have a bit of control over it because you're editing this, and I guess
It's been the first thing was when we did the Sagas of Norengard adventure book. I had four writers who write a lot for Cobalt Press, um, write adventures in my world. So I've already eased myself into letting go of the reins a little bit. And with this, I wrote it. I wrote my world as a children's story. These will be adult fantasy stories, and the stuff I'm getting, the material I'm getting in is fabulous. Um, it's 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 funny because I'm not being particular about the big overarching themes of the story. I'm not going, oh, that's not the kind of story I want to tell. But I am being picky about things like they cannot serve potatoes at the dinner table. There are no potatoes. No one in this country has ever seen a potato. Get the potato off the dinner table. Or uh, two writers, maybe three writers, have tried to write about thieves. And, the Scandinavian culture, they thought it was perfectly okay to get in a long ship, row a couple 100 miles, go to a village, butcher everyone, including the children, and take all their stuff. But you did not steal from your kinsfolk. You just didn't. It would get you exiled or enslaved. And thievery was one of the few crimes that they believed came with the price of eternal damnation, eternal punishment. It was like one of the only things you could do that made you suffer in the afterlife. So, when people want to keep writing about pickpockets, I'm like, they didn't have them. They didn't have them. There are no thieves in this culture.
All right. Well, this has been great. We got a question that came in, which I think is a great one to end on. What's the most recent book you read that you felt jealous of the premise and the universe?
I'm going to answer that two ways. I stopped reading fiction for a really long time. For a long time, I was just reading nonfiction and role playing game books. And I've just started back. I'm on a Michael Moorcock reread. My former agent Joe Monty is now the editor of Saga book for Saga Press for Simon and Schuster, and is putting out the definitive Elric collection in the author's preferred, all the books all gathered together in the author's preferred reading order. And I'm reading Elric for the first time since I was 15. I've read other Moorcock since then, but I haven't read Elric since I was 15, and it's holding up. It's holding up brilliantly. And I'm really jealous of just about everything: his prose, his scope, the whole. I'm in the Sailor of the Seas of Fate right now. I'm so jealous of that ship. I love the Gray Phase. There's so much in that I wish I'd come up with. I'm also I'm a big fan of Cobalt Press and Midgard, and I love they have the world tree that that is the world tree that all the realms are hung on. But then in their world, across their world, they have world trees, which are these giant, colossal, miles high trees that are scattered about the world. And there's about maybe 13 of them. And you can climb any world tree. And eventually, if you can climb for a couple days, reach the world tree and then come down somewhere else in the world or come down in another world. And I think that's a brilliant concept that I wish I'd come up with. And then finally, I can't talk too much about it, but I'm building something in the fantasy space for Meta right now. I've been doing it since January. That's the project that's consumed me full time. And in collaboration with a wonderful team, are coming up with a lot of stuff for that. And some of it's so good, I wish I'd thought of it before I thought of it.
Because now it's with them, right? Well, Lou, this has been wonderful. It's been right about an hour. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to me. I think this has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm glad we've had people come by and also be involved. And I really appreciate everybody who has been watching and who will watch this and repeat and on other clips. Will you tell everybody where they can find you? I've got the links that you sent me down below. So Twitter, Lou Anders, the links are down below, and also where you can buy this. But let everybody know where they can find you and
LouAnders.com. There's a Thrones and Bones page on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as @LouAnders, LouAnders. And if you go to DriveThruRPG and search for Lazy Wolf Studios, or just type in Lazy Wolf as 2 words, and you'll get all the game books. I also want to do a couple of shout outs. We have Heroic Maps did a whole series of map packs that accompany they are the maps in the adventure, but they're made for home printing or VTT display. And they've got all the maps out. And my friend Andrew Mills of Milestone Heroes makes 3D printed tabletop terrain. And he is just about to start. I think it comes out this week through his Patreon, releasing. He is determined to make 3D terrain based on every single adventure in the 2 books, so that you can play through the whole thing using 3D printed tabletop terrain. And his first offering is one of the Borrow Mounds, and it comes out this week.
Well, not too many people have that.
What's that?
Well, not too many people have that. Oh, like printable terrain for everything.
Yeah. I'm very spoiled.
Yeah, that's nice. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lou. Thank you, everybody. I guess we will try this again. I'm glad this has been successful. So maybe Table Talk will continue. Good night, everybody.